I want to begin by talking about something Yusuf and the Secretary touched upon, and really the news of the moment, which is the Russia-Ukraine crisis, its impact on oil, and whether you think this is going to have any impact on the region we're talking about, on Southern Africa. And I want to start by asking you that question, Sebastian.
Thank you, Mallika. Yeah, of course, it's a very big geopolitical shock that underlines the need to continue to push transforming the economy towards a more diverse source of generating electricity. You've seen that Germany announced that they will be fully renewable in a bit more than 10 years. Mm-hmm. You feel it in Mauritius, that energy costs have already a higher impact on the economy. And there is obviously a need to push this program forward. In Southern Africa, for instance, you can see that there's an opportunity also in such a situation that energy producers, oil producers will see a boost in their finances. Mm-hmm. On the other side, there are also exporters of minerals that are required for the renewable energy technologies, whether it's batteries or manufacture of wind turbines. They will also see increased demand if this transition is continued, and that is an opportunity for these countries.
Gilles, I want to come to you next. You know, countries are struggling in their transition towards green energy, sometimes for good reason, or rather understandable reasons, and sometimes for not so good reasons. What are some of the good/understandable regions they might face some challenges?
So I think if we talk about Africa in particular, you know, it is true that the global north emits 98% of the world's emissions. Mm-hmm. And so it is totally understandable that the global north started to bear the burden of the energy transition and the transition towards renewable energy, you know, basically starting at the end of the 90s, 2000. You know, Europe, North America had the capital, had sort of the mindset, if you will, and were at a trajectory, at a point in their trajectory that it made sense that they sort of started tackling, if you will, the start or the learning curve of the energy transition. I think now there are, you know, African countries have had other priorities. They've been looking very carefully at what is being done, and I think now it's the right time. Mm-hmm. You know, especially on the back of COP26 and the growing urgency that Africa is also facing in terms of the disproportionate impacts of climate change. I think now there is an opportunity, and it's the right time today, as opposed to, you know, 20 years ago. For, you know, Africa to capitalize on all its potential. It has hydro, it's got wind, it's got solar, it's got biomass, it's got geothermal, and so now is the right time. It's an opportunity that the continent absolutely has to seize, and is starting to seize.
Liz, I want to come to you next. You know, we're talking about some of the understandable reasons there are challenges, good reasons. You know, what are some of the not so good reasons that countries are facing this struggle as they try to move towards a greener energy future?
Yeah, I think that when making this transition, it's really critical to look at planning and having a solid plan and you know, a path to the future. But this is the first time in many cases in Southern Africa that countries are working on this. So that's all understandable, that it would be difficult. But I think that it was discussed earlier, you know, the importance of transparency. So I think, you know, transparency, thinking through having, you know, open tender processes, that's all really critical to be able to attract private investment, especially as we look at these sort of new or transitional energy technologies, to be able to get the best technology into countries. So I think that's really critical, that open, transparent process. And there have been some challenges around that in Southern Africa where the best intentioned plans are in place. That can be something that falters, and I think that's something that really needs to be a focus. Both setting the plan, setting clear priorities so that the private sector and your own population know what the plan is, what's to come, how you're going to be working on that transition, because as Gilles mentioned, it's not going to be something that just happens overnight. There is going to need to be a transition. There's going to need to be a focus on transitional fuel sources or generation sources to bring in those different factors. And so setting a clear plan will be really critical in an open, transparent process.
I want to take a step back here. When we're talking about renewable energy, which kind of renewable energy do you think has the most potential to transform this region? Are we talking about solar? Are we talking about hydro? I know your organizations are focusing on sort of different forms of renewable energy. Actually, Liz, let me start with you.
Yeah. I think when we look at Southern Africa, the current generation mix, there's a large amount that's hydro, and I think that's a great opportunity for the region. There is still more untapped hydro resources. They need to be managed, and there needs to be the correct environmental factors and considerations in place, especially as we look at the effects of climate change on those resources. We've seen in Zambia, for instance, there were some drought situations where the hydros weren't running at capacity. In Malawi, that's often a concern when there's a generation source that's down there. But continuing to develop hydro resources, but also the opportunity for solar and wind. And I think an interesting combination with battery technology will be really important to be able to create more of a baseload and peaking capability of solar and wind in combination with those resources like hydro. And then we're seeing across the continent, more of a use of gas that comes directly from the countries, and thinking about gas really as a transitional fuel, baseload to allow unlocking renewable energy. So that's really what the trends that we're seeing in Southern Africa.
Sebastian, are you seeing similar trends, or are you seeing more of an interest in solar?
Yeah, I very much reinforce what Liz said. Mm-hmm. I can state an example how actually the Mauritius Commercial Bank helped in this transitionary phase. For instance, in Senegal, they have a plan to be 100% electrified in 3 years' time, and we participated with an amount of 60 million and 140 million project financing for a transformation of a fuel oil power station into a liquefied natural power station, which now it's a bit more than 200 megawatts capacity, contributes 15% of the electricity in that particular country. Now, very much like Liz said, our main focus, we have other similar projects, our main focus in renewables is very much on solar and wind.
Solar and wind. Gilles, I want to come to you next. Hydro is a big part of the story, as we know, solar as well. One of the areas that has done very well, or sort of further down the road when it comes to renewable energy in Africa, is North Africa. And I wanted to ask you if you could tell us a little bit more about what's enabled that region to be ahead of the game, and what are some of the lessons that Southern Africa can pick up from there?
Sure. Basically, 4 or 5 African countries, including Egypt and Morocco, essentially have 40% of the power generation capacity.
40%.
40%, yeah.
Yeah.
Morocco, Egypt, South Africa, of course.
Yep.
And throw in Kenya. You're talking about 60 gigawatts out of 150 gigawatts of the whole continent. So, also in terms of energy access. Egypt, Morocco have almost universal energy access. That means that the last mile is going to 98% of the population. So these are, African countries who have, who stand ahead in a way, and who've made very significant strides in terms of tackling the infrastructure gap, the electricity infrastructure gap. I think it goes back a bit to what Liz has said. These are countries which enacted quite early a reform of the electricity sector, allowing private sector participation in power. So, historically, electricity generation and transmission, it's been public state monopoly. As Mr. Carlos Borges mentioned a few minutes ago, there's a change of paradigm. The private sector is coming to power generation, and that's good. It brings capital, it brings expertise, and it relieves the state of the burden of putting all of this investment on its balance sheet. And so I think that's exactly what countries like Morocco, South Africa, Egypt have done. They have recognized the need to reform the sector, the need to put in place a framework to attract investment. And they have operationalized these processes with new laws, new tender frameworks, new competitive procurement planning, long-term planning. They're saying, okay, we need 1 giga of capacity by this year, and we need another giga by this year. And I think this whole framework has made it very attractive for private investors to come in, supported by commercial and multilateral banks, and to bid, very high technology at very affordable costs. And I think this is the message for the rest of the continent, to look at your friends and your neighbors in the north, look at the neighbors and friends in the south, and see, the best practices that have actually worked in those countries.
I want to come to you next, Sebastian. Let's talk about the money part of it. Where is the financing coming from, and where should it come from? Which is it the public sector, private sector, blended finance? What's going to work for this region?
So Gilles just explained that private sector participation is what's
driving it forward.
What is being stimulated. Yeah. In the past, lots of these independent power projects have been financed by development finance institutions or multilateral organizations. Yeah, they are required. Their involvement is very much required to de-risk. They don't only contribute equity, debt, or other forms of capital, but they also contribute to de-risking projects in order to allow commercial lenders to participate in such a project. They provide more certainties to private sources of capital to participate.
I want to touch on one area which is sometimes considered a bit sensitive, but this whole debate about whether it's even fair to expect developing countries to ditch fossil fuels. The argument is like, hey, we're not done developing yet. We need fossil fuels to help us with our manufacturing, our development process. Liz, I just wondered if you wanted to weigh in on that.
Yeah. I think it's a good point, and I think Gilles kind of touched on this a little bit, but the time really is now. When you look at just the amount of infrastructure, the amount of generation capacity that's needed to provide universal access on the continent, new generation has to occur. Even in a country like South Africa, where there is a large amount of generation, they'll be needing to build new generation to replace existing generation that will need to be phased out, as well as ramp that up for industrialization. And I think instead of thinking about it in terms of fossil fuels or renewables, I think it's important to look at the future, and that it's going to be a new paradigm. Right? The generation of these new resources is going to happen in a way in Africa that was different than the way that the grid and the infrastructure was developed in the US or in Europe. And so I think it's an opportunity to integrate technologies and utilize these new resources and technologies. When you think about something like solar, well, it's not a baseload technology. Its input cost is minimal because you're using the sun, right? So you're not going to have the volatility of diesel. You're not going to have the volatility of oil prices, using like an HFO plant, for instance. So I think that's really critical to think about the future and to to integrate those new technologies into this, future solution. So you're not, 20 years down the line, 30 years down the line in a situation where you're having to do what, other countries have done in the past. You have the opportunity now. You're going to need to spend that capital now, look at opportunities to build these renewable technologies. It doesn't mean that there's not going to be, a need for potentially some gas in a transitional, capacity. But I think that that's something, you should be looking at these sort of new technologies and new solutions. I think it's also really critical to think about the role that kind of regional integration plays in this, especially in Southern Africa, through the Southern Africa Power Pool. There's an opportunity to use the resources of multiple countries across the region in a way that allows for these new technologies to come in at kind of the least cost potential options. And with that increased integration, it should hopefully counterbalance some of the cost pressure that you see in renewables, and you can use the hydros from some countries to help balance the renewables, and then kind of collectively improve the ability to scale those technologies. But the capital investment has to occur, so look at the sort of cutting edge new technologies when you're looking to invest in these technologies.
Maybe to this point,
yes,
I wanted to add, it's worthwhile noting that actually in Africa, Africa is at the forefront of using renewables in rural areas.
Yes.
To connecting and bringing actually electricity to people that are deprived of that.
The people who don't have access to the grid, for example, right? Can you give us an example of how that's working?
Well,
is it solar and we talked about this
the technology is solar.
Yes. Yeah. So, and is it like, I remember seeing this in India, solar villages, entire villages that were close to the grid but had no access to the grid, but you had solar technology reaching very remote areas where the grid can't.
Yeah.
And that's really important. I think, Liz, you touched upon it earlier, for energy access, right?
Yeah, I think when you look at the electrification goals of Southern Africa, they're very aggressive, and they need to happen quickly, at a pace that countries have never seen before, and haven't electrified their populations. And in some cases, when you look at the least cost options for electrification, grid extension is not in those places, and or is not in those places now. And so I think that looking at the use of mini grids, whether that's solar mini grids with battery backup, or you're looking at mini hydro mini grids when you happen to be lucky enough to have a remote village that's near a river, so you can do something like run a river, or through the use of solar home systems and other kind of advanced solar technologies for off-grid electrification. It's an opportunity that the private sector can play a role in. If you structure those deals and you allow for the enabling environment for the private sector to come and sell solar home systems, I think that there's a great opportunity. But again, similar to on-grid projects, to be able to enable the private investment, there has to be the right type of enabling environment. You have to allow for those systems to be sold at cost, or there has to be some sort of support, whether from IFIs or other donors or the government directly support, because in some places, in rural parts of Southern Africa, the affordability isn't there. So until they have some sort of opportunity for economic improvement and can afford these systems, there'll be similar challenges to affordability and the ability to attract the private sector. But it's going to play a critical role, and it really is, solar technologies, but in different ways of applying those solutions.
Sebastian, let's talk about the impact of the pandemic on supply chains. And when it comes to solar technology, for example, a lot of the solar panels are imported into this region. Have you heard of how has the pandemic and the broken supply chains affected this, and has it resulted in costs of solar technology going up?
Yeah, so the pandemic had a number of effects. Obviously, we now live in a more inflationary environment, so costs have gone up. Logistical supply chains have been disrupted, so therefore projects have been delayed.
Yeah.
And also, government budgets have been reallocated, sometimes from renewable projects, power projects, to more pressing projects.
Health
healthcare.
infrastructure,
Yeah.
things like that, yeah. I want to talk about job creation. Africa has a really youthful population, and Gilles, I'll come to you next. The movement towards green energy, how vital is this for job creation opportunities?
So I think there's a discourse around climate change and renewable energy between the North and the South that one has to be careful, because the North would like to see the South contribute to abating emissions. The South needs jobs, good jobs. There's a very strong demographic pressure. You know, and all these young, bright minds want challenging, interesting jobs. And one has to be careful that the renewable energy industry is not necessarily, you know, if you look at the power plant, a solar power plant, it creates 500 jobs during construction. But then during operation, you know, modern technology allows you to operate a modern plant with very few people. So that's already a good source of job creation. You have electricians, civil engineers, mechanical engineer, people getting their hands into the technology of the future, which is fantastic. But I think to complete that story of job creation, you also need to look at the ecosystem, the supply chain. You cannot continue to say we are going to develop a plant that creates 500 temporary jobs for 1 year and then creates 10 direct jobs for 20 years. I know this is controversial from the point of view of global trade, you know, and protectionism, but I firmly believe that governments need to promote also the ecosystem of local manufacturing. Some countries are doing it. Some countries, South Africa did it in the initial rounds of the solar program to require that part of the module supply chain, the assembly, is done locally. So I think we need to work much harder, and the countries need to work much harder in capturing the jobs around this whole industry. And this is also for electrical mobility, by the way, where we're starting to see more and more light transport, electrical light transport coming in. We're starting to see a host of new economies developing, but we need to be careful that the countries capture that also from the supply chain point of view.
Mm-hmm. Sebastian, I want to come to you next. COP this year is in Africa, and because it's being held in Africa this year, do you think it's going to change the tone or change the conversation a little bit, and what are you hopeful for? What are you hopeful that this region will be able to achieve at COP this year?
I'm hopeful that, the region will continue its path towards more sustainable electricity generation and reduction of carbon emissions, of course.
Is there any pressing decision you're hoping will come out of it? And do you think because it's being held in Africa, it will have an impact on the dialogue?
Well, a host will always have an opportunity to shape the dialogue, hopefully.
Yeah. We've had some audience questions come in, and I wanted to present them to you. One of them is, what is the role of waste to energy technology in the development of African energy reliability, health, and job creation? Yeah,
so I'll take that one. So in terms of waste to energy, it's a tricky technology, to be very frank. And when you look at the investors that implement into that space, the main thing that they look at is making sure that the source of that waste is easy to collect and that they have high confidence that they're going to be able to use that waste source. So when we look at the role that we'll play in Southern Africa, it's not a key focus technology. We are seeing some interest in some municipal governments or national governments where they have a cleaner kind of supply chain around waste to look at those opportunities and wanting to learn from some of the waste to energy solutions that do exist in Europe. But one of the big issues is you need to be able to do waste to energy at scale to make it cost effective, and you need to have a clean kind of input source, and that's quite difficult to get, and sometimes beyond the sort of waste management practices of certain economies. So it's just something to look out for.
Yes.
I would like to add to that, because it's a subject which is very close to my heart. I mean, the waste time bomb is ticking for Africa. Europe is if you look at the statistics of how waste is recycled or incinerated in Europe, and I would imagine a little bit less so in North Africa. The circular economy is fundamental. We cannot avoid it, and so incineration of waste, as opposed to landfilling waste and destroying the water and the air is critical. I would slightly disagree with you. The technology is there. Standard sort of great boilers or standard incineration. I wouldn't go down the way of the more sophisticated technologies, waste to gas or gasifiers. But the technology is there. The problem is the political, often at the municipal level, the political will to put together a framework where waste is collected and delivered to the power station in a way that fits with a business model. You can, because it has to be, it's a classical case of private-public partnerships. You need to have the public side of the equation supporting the private investor with, yes, you're going to have waste under these conditions for this period of time, and you can rest assured. And if that can be solved, then it will happen. There is currently one incineration plant, as far as I know, in Africa. It's in Addis Ababa.
Just one?
Just one. That's a tragedy. It has to change. So I think, we need to do waste to energy, but the governments need to promote it and to tackle the problems.
A lot of opportunity there. We have one last question I want to address, which came in from the audience, and it's not specifically about energy, but it is specifically for this panel. And it says, how does Southern Africa public debt affect FDI decision making? And it's come in specifically for this panel. Who would like to take that?
I think that the governments need to work together with the private sector to help promote, infrastructure investment. The problem is in the last 2 years, the governments have been distracted, rightfully so, by the pandemic, by the pressing needs to address the immediate necessities. So yes, we have seen a reduction in engagement because of more immediate priorities rather than long-term focuses. Also, the capacity of governments to provide guarantees to projects. I mean, today the paradigm of an IPP is that at the end of the day, the government guarantees the debt of the lenders. So the lenders know that if the off-taker doesn't pay the bill, they can go to the government. But the IMF is now telling the governments, your balance sheet, you've been spending so much money on public needs that you are limited by your capacity to issue guarantees. And that's a problem, right? Because it slows down the development of new offtake agreements. So clearly the pandemic has not helped at all.
No, of course not. Gilles, Liz, Sebastian, thank you so much for your time and for your insights. We've come a long way in the journey towards a green energy future, but of course there's a long way to go, but also a lot of opportunity. So we'll leave it at that positive note. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And with that, I'm going to hand it over to David.